Hello and welcome everyone who is joining this morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar all about the new B Corp standards. In a few moments, myself and Amy will be guiding you through what you need to know to make the most of these new standards. So we will wait a few minutes for everyone to get settled. In the meantime, do make sure you're sitting comfortably, you have a cup of tea or coffee if you need, and we will get going in a couple of minutes. Good morning to those who have just joined us, and thank you, Claire, for your answer in the chat. So as we wait for people to get settled into the session this morning, we would love to get to know you a little bit better and where you're at with the new standards. So please, as others have, say hello in the chat and answer with where you are. And feel free to say a bit about where you're coming from. So thanks, Amy, for joining from London. It'd be lovely to know a bit about where you're joining from this morning. We've got lots of people answering one who are B Corps looking to recertify. We've got some 2s and 3s. People from Belgium, St Albans, welcome from Cornwall. Sarah is joining from a vineyard. I hope you're having a wonderful time there. I'm a little bit jealous. Good morning. Nikki from Shropshire, Nicola from Newcastle. Thank you so much for answering where you currently are with the new standards. Looks like there's a real range of what people are keen to learn about today and where they are at. So with that, let's get started. Today, we want to help you, our vibrant, engaged community, get the most value from these new B Corp standards, which were launched just over 4 weeks ago on the 4th of April. It's great to see in the participant list many friendly faces today and also some new ones. Noting that not all of you in the room are existing members of the community, I'm going to take a brief moment to fill you in a little bit on who Seismic is. So our mission at Seismic is to help businesses prosper by helping them become an increasingly impactful and influential force for good. You all here are representing businesses, but ultimately we are all people, and it's people that will make this change happen. We have an explicit goal of helping 10 million people join the shift towards becoming a force for good. And we can only do that by collaborating, working and partnering together with companies like you. And right now we're working with approximately 120 businesses within Europe, but also have work in APAC, the Americas and beyond. To achieve our mission, we do this through 2 things. First thing we do is we help businesses and people in businesses build a strategy which speaks to your commercial and sustainability goals. And then secondly, we partner with those organizations to embed and execute that strategy. And we do that through leveraging a number of frameworks such as B Corp, net zero, carbon, and circular economy principles. We also partner closely with B Lab and have done so for many years. Our co-founders, Amy and Andy, have trained over 360 B leaders between them, and collectively, we've seen hundreds of businesses leverage the B Corp framework. We'll now show you a sample of businesses that we've been very fortunate to have worked with to help achieve and reach their sustainability ambitions. So now you know a little bit about the business. I'll say a brief introduction. My name's Olivia Jennings. It's a pleasure to see some of you and meet you for the first time, those who I've not met before. I'm a consultant at Seismic, and I've been part of the team helping a number of businesses already to leverage the new B Corp standards. For today's agenda, here is how we're going to help you get the most out of the new B Corp standards. So firstly, we're going to be giving you a succinct summary of what you need to know based on our experience. We will be sharing pragmatic tips and watch outs in terms of conducting a gap analysis and beginning to apply the standards already from us doing so in practice. And plus, finally, and most importantly, we will be opening the floor to cover as many questions as we can that you have about the new B Corp standards. So in terms of questions, we will be covering questions that are asked in the Q&A function today. So please do add your questions to that function throughout. Don't feel the need to wait till the end when we get to the questions section. If you can submit your question early, that really helps us maximize the chance that we can get to your question. So the sooner you can submit it, the better, and the more questions, the better. With that, gives me great pleasure to introduce Amy Bourbeau, who is our co-founder and Chief Impact Officer at Seismic. Chris Turner, who is the Executive Director of B Lab UK, has said himself that Amy knows more about the B Corp framework than he does. So you're in very safe hands as she takes you through the summary of what you need to know about these new standards. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. Wonderful to see so many of you, and really delighted that we can dive into this really important and honestly exciting topic of the new B Corp standards. So I guess to kind of start out with, like Olivia said, a little bit of an overview of what this is all about and why as well, because it's important to acknowledge and reflect on, why this is happening. And I think that we're all very aware that as with the world in general, but especially in sustainability, it is such a fast-moving space, both in regards to innovation and evolution of best practice, but also in regards to the ever-increasing urgency with which we need to act. And so, it's true what B Lab say, and what I'm sure many of us say, which is that standing still is not an option. We need to be continually moving forward. And so after 4 years of development, 26,000 plus pieces of feedback, and multiple drafts, it is very exciting that the new version of the B Corp standards are here. And this is the biggest evolution of the standards since they first launched in 2007. I've had the pleasure of engaging with the B Corp framework for the last decade, and in fact a little longer. And this is I think the third evolution that I've seen, and certainly the most inspiring one. So it's an exciting time for sure. And I think, just to kind of reflect on that why that I said, I think it's really important that the intention, I think, behind B Lab and behind a lot of people in the B Corp community is that B Corps should be leading the way for businesses and leading the way to create genuinely a more inclusive and sustainable economy. And to do that, we need to have faith in the standards that we're meeting, and we need to ensure that they are the best of the best. And so really this is about, first of all, raising the bar to accelerate that action, to make sure that we are living the intention of leading that way to a better economy. It's also about aligning to, other frameworks and best practice. So we'll talk a bit more about it, but one of the great things about these new standards is they are aligned with globally recognized frameworks to pull together, the work that is being collectively done across incredible minds and bodies, and to kind of unite in a little bit more of an organized way. And then also another thing that's constantly evolving, of course, is the legal and regulatory landscape. And this is, across a number of different areas, including communications around green claims, and including kind of what it means to be a standard. And actually, one of the main things about this evolution is that this is kind of shifting B Corp from a framework and from a recognition of companies who do a lot of great things to actually a specific standard that is a little bit more definitive. So to that point, what is the bottom line of these changes? Well, essentially, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you know, I know that there's a lot of companies here who are already B Corps. on the current standards, you need to score 80 points and the assessment and verify that you're scoring those points. That leaves a large degree of flexibility because technically, if you were scoring every possible point, you could be in the 200s plus of points. So it means that you have to be doing some things well, but there's other things that you don't have to be engaging with. For example, you could currently be a B Corp, but not be measuring your carbon footprint at all. And what this is shifting to is to a model where there are minimum requirements that a company needs to meet in order to become a B Corp. And those are going to be across these 7 impact pillars, which I will talk more about in a minute. So some of the benefits of this are, just that kind of increasingly raising the bar. That's really what this is all about. But also, it's still really holistic. It's still, this new standards are still covering the breadth of the organization. They're still considering all stakeholders. It is still also going to be tailored to companies based on their size and sector. But actually, there's 2 more brackets included as well, which is kind of to acknowledge the growth of the B Corp movement, both not only in the number of companies certifying, but in the size and profiles of the companies that want to come into the movement. And also, as I said, ensuring that it is compliant with kind of major regulations. So the new standards have been designed with green claims and empowering consumers directives in mind, which I'm going to talk a bit more about in a minute. It's important to kind of flag for the EU empowering consumers directives that this will be quite relevant to some of you. And then, as I mentioned, there's this large degree of interoperability, which is basically just a fancy way of saying overlap between the B Corp standards and other globally recognized and valued frameworks like the ESRS behind the CSRD, the GRI, things like that, so that we are, like I said, kind of uniting people, and instead of having kind of these fractious different standards, we're coming together to kind of focus our efforts and our energy and be more effective, hopefully. And then I think what's really quite exciting about this as well is that there's an increased level of clarity of what it means to be B Corp with these new standards. Because like I said, whereas currently what we mean when we say you're a B Corp, you know that you are a company that is meeting a high standard of social and environmental performance, but you don't necessarily know what that means literally. So if I buy something that is B Corp certified, I don't know that they've definitely paid their workers a living wage, or I don't know that they have a carbon reduction plan. But now we will know that there are specific ways that B Corps behave, and what it literally means to be a B Corp. And then also from a kind of technical point of view, it's quite exciting that there is a much deeper level of transparency on what the specific guidance for the standards is, with detail about what you need to be doing to be meeting these standards. So whereas if you've been through the current B Corp assessment, you'll probably have experienced that there's there's a lot of nuance, and there's also a fair bit that's a little bit open to interpretation, and sometimes a bit of a guessing game. What does that actually mean? Now there is a lovely 1,000 plus page PDF document that explains all of those expectations and definitions in detail, which is really helpful. So just to be clear on the timeline for change and where we're at. So the standards were published a few weeks ago now, almost a month ago. And now we are in the phase of B-Lab kind of supporting the pathway for organizations to transition to those. And so the kind of basic description of it is that if you are currently a B Corp, or if you are currently on the pathway to certify and your submission date can be this year, or your resubmission date is required to be this year, you can certify, or you can submit on version 6, the current version. Or if you are aiming to certify for the first time, or you are planning to recertify in 2026 or beyond, then you should be transitioning to the new standards, version 7. And companies will start to submit and start to certify on the new standards in 2026 and beyond. So exciting stuff, and the changes coming soon. So we definitely recommend kind of jumping in sooner rather than later on that. So what are these new standards? I'll go into a little bit more detail about what it is that they actually cover. So the new standards, they revolve around these 7 impact pillars plus a pillar of foundational requirements. Now, the foundational requirements is to do with making sure that you have you're meeting the requirements of a company that can become a B Corp. So essentially, are you eligible to certify? And this is to do with being able to meet the legal requirement that comes along with being a B Corp. That's your amendment to your Articles of Association. It is about creating a risk profile and then potentially addressing any specific risks that are related to you because of maybe your industry or your location, etc. And generally making sure that you are a for-profit company that is eligible to certify. Then we get into the pillars, which are kind of focused on your actual impact. So I'm going to do a quick kind of high-level description of each of them, and then I'll do a deep dive into one just to kind of bring it to life a bit. So the purpose and stakeholder governance section is really, the current BIA, it starts with governance, and this new standard starts with governance as well. It's really at the core of a responsible business. And so it looks at topics like that you need to have a publicly available purpose that is linked to having some kind of positive impact. It is requiring that you are considering your stakeholders in decision making, that you are also looking after those stakeholders. So you have grievance procedures in place to listen to and address concerns or grievances of stakeholders. It's about also being responsible in regards to your communications and your marketing externally. And for larger organizations, it's about things like making sure that your board of directors or whatever your highest kind of governing body is have a kind of clear responsibility linked to social and environmental performance. And they're not only overseeing it, but they are responsible for it. And also that you're having to be kind of transparent about your social and environmental performance. As I go through these, there's just a reminder that the assessment is tailored to companies based on their size and sector. So not every company will have to meet all of these kind of descriptors that I'm going through. It does depend also a bit on your size and your sector. So fair work is, kind of what it says on the tin. It's about ensuring that your employees are well looked after, and the people who are contributing work to your business are well looked after. So it's about setting kind of clear expectations of employees, having proper contracts and processes in place for that, having fair wage practices. So that might be transparency on pay. That might be working towards increasing pay and reducing pay gaps. It's about making sure you have the channels to receive feedback from your employees and you're listening to that feedback and addressing it. And also measuring your workplace culture and taking action to improve it. We then have JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And this, again, kind of does what it says on the tin, but essentially it boils down to collecting data on on principles and metrics that relate to these topics, and then having an action plan in place to improve your performance in this area. There's a relatively high degree of flexibility of how that is done, and you can kind of pick and choose from a number of different options of how you do that, but you need to be taking some kind of tangible action on the topic of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We then move on to human rights, which is one of the areas, most of these topics have been included in past versions, but human rights is one that I would say is the newest, or was featured the least in the last versions. And here we are looking at kind of publicly committing to human rights, but also ensuring that the company has reviewed and understands any salient human rights risks and issues in their value chain, and that you have a strategy to address it, essentially, and that you are kind of preventing and mitigating any potentially negative human rights impacts, and also in instances where this is relevant, that the company is kind of working with and engaging your suppliers on these human rights objectives. We've then got climate action. So, again, an interesting thing to call out here is that on the current version of the assessment, environment falls into one big bracket. Here it's being pulled into two, with one specifically focused on climate. And, that's kind of acknowledging the climate crisis that we are in. And so here, companies are having to kind of measure their greenhouse gas emissions, and or have, net zero pathways in place, and or carbon transition, climate transition plans in place. Sorry, climate action plans is the word I was looking for. And again, varying degrees of specificity depending on the track that you're on, but you need to be taking action in some regard to measuring and reducing your carbon footprint. Then we have everything else in relation to the environment. So the environmental stewardship and circularity pillar looks at that the company kind of understands and is measuring its actual and potential impacts on the environment, and then it has a strategy to address it, essentially. But this is, looking at water, waste, energy, biodiversity, and ensuring that you have, kind of appropriate plans and strategies in place to measure and reduce those in a meaningful way. And there's also kind of a clear recognition of circularity, and ensuring that companies are focusing on, where possible and relevant, implementing circularity principles, and in general kind of reducing their waste. And also, where relevant, this would be about doing that in your own facilities, but also engaging your suppliers on achieving environmental objectives. And then finally, we have government affairs and collective action, which covers topics such as responsible lobbying, and working and kind of, for those who are relevant, probably not for most of us, but for much larger organizations, around kind of having a transparent approach to taxes. But I think most interestingly here, this is a requirement and an opportunity to kind of collaboratively work with others. And this might be your peers, it might be your industry, it might be the B Corp community, it might be something else wider, it might be your local community, your suppliers, but to try and kind of advance standards and advance change from a social and environmental impact point of view. And when you think about the thousands of companies who are in the B Corp community, if we think about each of those taking even just one step further to kind of influence collective action, that is a huge amount of influence that we could have globally. So that's quite an exciting one as well. So just to kind of bring this to life a bit of what this literally looks like and how you literally engage with these, let's just dive into an example of purpose and stakeholder governance. So the next slide is a bit overwhelming. It's a lot of words, I will warn you, but here is an example of what a medium-sized company on the retail wholesale track would have to do within this pillar. And a medium-sized company is a company that's between 50 to 250 employees, and or their revenue is above 10 million or below 75 million in revenue, just for context. And so we can see here that there are these kind of specific requirements within each of there's sub requirements within each of the requirements that kind of demonstrate a bit further what the company needs to do. So they've got to have that public purpose, as I mentioned, in regards to considering its impact on stakeholders in decision making. What's laid out here, which is having a policy, having a materiality assessment, and then making sure that the materiality assessment is kind of covering a wider range of topics and that you've set targets based on that and report on those. That is going to be, that's a fairly thorough set of requirements for that, whereas a smaller organization might have to do one or two things and that might be a little different or lighter to that. And etc. with the rest of them here. We then still have, within each of these sentences, that these are considerable kind of requirements, and we want to understand, well, what does that actually mean? So if we hone in, let's say, on one of them, so let's say here the company conducts regular materiality assessment and assesses and identifies material topics. That could be done in a number of different ways. There's different methodologies. There's, different, how do you define exactly what that is? So then we have a deeper level of compliance criteria within that. So if we zoom into that specific piece, so you can see up at the top, there's then multiple compliance criteria beneath that, which go into more detail. So for example, the materiality assessment has to engage with that following list of stakeholders for it to be recognized by B Lab and to recognize that you are meeting that standard. So it's really valuable and useful to have this level of clarity, but it also kind of helps to kind of show the scale of consideration behind things.
Hi, Amy. We've had lots of great questions and we've had one particularly relevant to this topic. So I thought I'd put it to you now. It's from Adelaide. And he said, thank you. They've said, thank you for the information. Where can we find a list of what we need to put in place depending on sector and size, so that we can assess whether we can reach these standards?
Good question. So you can, if you have a B impact assessment, and if you don't, I recommend making one ASAP. Log into the assessment. On your dashboard, you will see an option to explore the new standards. And before you do that, make sure your track is correct and up to date. But yeah, just click into that new standards piece and you will then see, you'll be able to click into each section. There is also a PDF version of the standards available. Is quite overwhelming. It's over 1,000 pages long, but if you have the patience, you can refer to that. But I recommend just going onto your live BIA. Perfect. Okay, I'm gonna power through with just a few flags and details, and then we can jump into more questions, which I look forward to. So a few things to note, and for those of you who are newer to B Corp, this might not mean so much to you, but for those of us who have been engaging with the standards kind of consistently, there may be some things we're surprised to hear. So first thing to let you know is that impact business models, those are the sections of the assessment that currently kind of open up to recognize companies that are going over and above in regards to impact. Impact business models are currently going to be paused. B Lab is going to be reviewing and looking at how impact business models are recognized and reviewed in the new standards, but that is kind of the next thing for them to think about. They've got quite a lot on their plate. So for now, it's paused and there will not be impact business models on the new version of the standards until further notice. We look forward to hearing what happens with those in the future. Similarly to that, there are going to be no performance indicators. So in the current version of the assessment, obviously your score is an indicator of your performance and how near or far you are to the 80 threshold. Also, there was some talk in the draft in the drafting of these new standards, there was some talk of having recognition of kind of companies who not only meet but exceed some of the standards, or potentially even having kind of a bronze, silver, gold type of recognition. None of that will be occurring. Essentially, all you'll know is that a company is a B Corp, which means that they've met all the requirements, or they're not. Also to call out, and this is another benefit of the new standards, very cool, is the requirement for continuous improvement. So there are currently year 0, year 3, and year 5 requirements built into the assessment. And that means that a company needs to, in order to stay a B Corp, needs to not only maintain their performance, but needs to continuously improve it. Because again, on the current approach to certification, a company could have had 100 points on one round of certification and then recertify on 82 points. And that's not great, but it's okay. And so obviously that's kind of counter to the intention of maintaining and improving performance over time. So to be clear, year 0, when you see year 0 written on anything, year 0 is just the first year that you are certifying. So as a new B Corp, obviously that's your first time that you're coming to it. But as an existing B Corp, you will still be on year 0 when you transition to the new standards, because it's the first year that you are coming to these new standards. And then obviously year 3 is 3 years down the line when you come to recertify, etc. And then the other thing to call out is that B Lab will be shifting to a third-party verification approach. So at present, the standards team are a kind of independent body within B Lab, but they're still a part of B Lab. And so they're coming away from that and moving towards outsourcing and having verification be done by a third party. The details of that are still being worked out. Again, it's a huge undertaking, and so B Lab are currently working to identify their partners and how this is going to look, and they will, of course, be sharing once that's all ironed out, and they can share more details. A few other quick flags to highlight for you. As I kind of mentioned already, there is a slightly new approach to calculating track sizes. So from a industry point of view, that all stays the same, the sector that you're in. But from a size point of view, first of all, there's these 2 new brackets added. So it used to be that the largest track was 1,000 plus, but in recognition of the increasing amount of large organizations that are in the movement, there's now a 1,000 to 10,000 and a 10,000 plus track. We're also moving into where it used to be just that your track was based purely on the number of full-time equivalent workers. There's now a model where the size tracks are labeled by small, medium, large, extra large, etc. And it's based on either the number of employees that you have or which revenue bracket you're in, noting that this is US dollars. And so it's whichever one is bigger that is going to determine which track you are on. So that might mean for some of you who are either already B Corps or who are not B Corps, but you have a track already, you have an assessment already made, your track might change. So pay close attention to that, and do check if you need to change your track. There is also, quite cool, additional compliance criteria for wholly owned subsidiaries. So there's quite a lot of wholly owned subsidiaries of organizations who are not yet certified in the B Corp community. And there's a recognition that sometimes that adds an extra level of complexity. And so not for every requirement, but for some requirements, there are kind of additional criteria laid out for how you apply the requirements to an entity that is certifying separately from its parent. It's not about making it harder for those companies. It's just about ensuring that the performance genuinely sits within the certifying entity rather than in the parent company. Next thing is quite a relevant thing, and it could influence what your pathway to transitioning to the new standards looks like. So many of you, I'm sure, are aware about the upcoming EU Empowering Consumers Directive. This is essentially a directive that is being put in place in the EU to kind of protect consumers and prevent greenwashing and outsized claims in regards to sustainability. And the gist of it, I'm going to put it briefly into layman's terms, and to be clear, none of this is yet set in stone. It's set to launch in September 2026, but these things have a habit of being pushed out, and also some of the details are yet to be defined. But essentially, as it stands now, if you are a B Corp that has certified on the current version of the standards, so where you need to meet 80 points, that version of the standards, once this directive launches, you will not be able to use the B Corp logo when selling in the EU, because it will not be kind of compliant with the directive. So this is just to be clear, sorry, this is just for companies who sell a product or service to consumers in the EU. And so those companies who are affected by the directive may then want to transition to version 7, because version 7, the new version of the standards, has been developed with this in mind, and so will be compliant with the directive, and you will be able to use the logo, etc. So B Lab is really acknowledges that this is less than ideal, and they're working really hard to try and accommodate for companies who this impacts, and kind of help them to go through this kind of transition. And so a couple key things to note there is that B Lab is trying to figure out exactly what this means for them. There is a link actually that we'll share in the follow-up, where B Lab want to understand how many of their members this influences. So please do share that feedback with them. But they're indicating things like they will likely be supporting companies to either wait and recertify on version 7 instead of recertifying now on version 6, or they might expedite companies' recertifications who were meant to recertify on version 7 after 26 to move it up to certify earlier, so that you're not impacted by the directive. Bit confusing, but we will be sharing more detail on this going forward. So stay tuned if you think this impacts you, and don't be afraid to ask questions about it. And then finally, there also may still be some adjustments and tweaks, and this might be tiny bit to the standards. It might be more likely it'll be to kind of some of the compliance criteria details or the guidance. There's also still some glitches that need to be ironed out. So do kind of stay vigilant, keep your eyes open, and do report any glitches or issues to B Lab so that they can be made aware of it and they can fix those things as they arise. Okay, I'm conscious that was a lot of information to share with you, and I'm really keen to get to your questions. But just to quickly kind of summarize, what now? How do you move forward from here? Essentially, first thing to do is to check and confirm when it's right for you to transition to the new standards. And to inform this decision, there's a few things to consider. One is that there is kind of a hard cutoff of companies being able to submit on the current standards, and that is related to either your recertification date, or if you're submitting for the first time, whether you're doing it this year, 25, or next year. But also it might be influenced by the Empowering Consumers Directive, if neither of those things influence you, it's also just based on your current performance and your current ambition. So there's a lot of things to consider about when it's right for you to transition to those standards. But when you are ready to, we highly recommend jumping straight in. The first thing to do is a gap analysis on the new standards so you can identify what are you already hitting, what are you kind of partially hitting, and where have you not yet done any work and you need to start fresh. And that obviously will help to inform the size um, of the pathway for you. And then really, the additional specificity and clarity, these have transitioned really from, we've called them standards always, but actually before it's been a framework that you can choose from, which is great and has been very helpful. But these are now a standard, and it's a really, thorough and impactful standard. And so we strongly recommend embedding this standard into your sustainability strategy and your longer term one as well, because bearing in mind there's those kind of additional requirements for the future years. So it kind of helps you to think about not only what we should be doing now, but what we should be planning going forward. And then finally, as I said, there's a lot of information. We are going to be continuing to share more information and updates and things like that. So stay tuned to continue learning, because this is just the beginning of the journey. And with that, we actually just wanted to ask you a question, please, which is, we'd love to just understand what information you would value the most in regards to what you'd like to learn. So if you wouldn't mind taking a second to just answer the poll, that would be really helpful to us to make sure that we're sharing the right detail with you all. And with that, I will hand over to Olivia.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that. And I'm seeing lots of responses coming through in the poll. Thank you for that. Keep them coming through. We're going to take that away and make sure that we've got the right content for you to answer those needs. We've had lots of fantastic questions through from the over 100 of you with us, so thank you for that. I'm going to start with some around recertification and the timelines. So Laura asked, Amy, do you know if recertification is still every 3 years? With this mention of year 3 and 5 milestones, how will that work?
Good question. Essentially, we don't know yet. I think we could take it as a hint in that there is this 5-year milestone that potentially it will go, you recertify at 3 years' time and then at the 5-year period, but B-Lab haven't confirmed that yet. So we will see, essentially. One of the things we're waiting to hear.
Thank you, Amy. So now we've got some questions around the kind of the points in the IBM changes. So Jane asks and says she loves the raising of the bar and establishing some ethical and impact-driven basics. But we've wondered internally how removing points impacts some of the flexibility and weighted elements, as well as measuring quantifiable growth. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely valid, and absolutely it does remove the flexibility, and that's part of the point, to my thing that I was saying around, this actually is shifting from what, being a B Corp has been about doing a lot of things well, but not necessarily knowing or specifying what those things that you're doing well are. And it's moving from that into a B Corp as a company who specifically takes action on these topics. And which I mean, we could all debate this and it would be great to chat to you, for hours about it. But, I think that in general, that's what we need. We need to make sure that it means something tangible to be a B Corp, and that it's about taking action. So yeah, it is much more prescriptive. There is still a degree, as I said, it's still tailored to companies based on their size and sector. And there's also, in some of the areas, a degree of flexibility in regards to, as I gave the example with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's some questions in there, or sorry, not questions, requirements in there, and in other parts where you have, for example, a list and they say you need to be doing 3 out of the 15 things on this list. And so you can select the things that make most sense to you. In regards to the continuous improvement piece of measuring, where you're at and seeing that increase, it won't be the same as saying we were on this many points and now we're on that many. But there is that continuous improvement requirement built in, and so the direction of improvement and the requirement to do that still exists. In fact, more now than ever, because before it wasn't a requirement and now it is. So it's just different. It takes a bit of getting used to, but yeah.
Definitely. And to build on that, we had an anonymous question asking if it was compulsory to meet all the requirements under the new version, or are some parts optional? So I'll take that one and say, for the majority of the requirements that apply to you, yes, it will be compulsory. Some of the requirements have a degree of choice. For example, in Jedi, you can pick 1 or 2 requirements from a long list, but for most of these requirements, they will be mandatory. So there is less flexibility. You should be aiming to meet all of them for your track and year. So now we've got some other questions. One from Thomas, which is interesting about the community. Currently, there are around 10,000 B Corps. Has B Lab thought about if how the current community will evolve in size and quality?
Yeah, I mean, listen, to be clear, we're not B Lab, and so I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but from conversations that I've had with various leaders at B Lab, I mean, of course, that is something that they've considered, and I think we're all interested to see how this impacts the shape of the community. In regards to the quality piece, it can only increase the quality of B Corps, because this is a step up in expectation, and so what we know, we don't know, if it'll increase the number of B Corps, or if for a while it'll decrease, or exactly what that flow will look like. But what we do know is that companies, as they transition onto these new standards, will be held to a much more rigorous standard, and therefore the quality of B Corps will only continue to increase, which is important. That's what we need.
Definitely. I agree with you there, Amy. We have a question from Lee, which I think is a really good one. Why would a company embarking on B Corp today want to use the V6 standards rather than jumping straight into V7? Is there a time and cost benefit to going to V6, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things to consider there. One thing is that some companies have been working on the current versions and progressing on them. And so you might have invested a lot of time, energy, money, etc., into certifying on version 6. And so if you've done that and it still makes sense, and if you're not impacted by the EU Consumer Directive, then it makes sense to keep going on that and to certify and use all the work that you've done on that. Also, to be frank, like, it's a bit easier. There is that degree more flexibility. They are an older set of standards. And so it's a little bit more of like an on-ramp, because if you've already made the effort, you're kind of close to certifying on the current version, it just gives you a little bit more breathing room before you have to transition onto the new standards. So yeah, those are the reasons why you might want to stick to V6.
Thanks, Amy. And then we've had a couple questions around the gap analysis framework. So our audience would like to know, is B Lab going to provide a framework for the analysis and doing comparisons and understanding gaps? Because it could be quite onerous for companies to do on their own. How do we recommend going through the questions and conducting that gap analysis?
Yeah. Yeah. So as I mentioned, when you log into the B Impact assessment on your dashboard, there is an option to explore the new standards. And then within that, there's a kind of self-assessment, they're calling it, which is where you'll be able to see what your specific requirements are based on your track. And like I said, do check that you're on the right track. and you can there's like tools that you can use, so you can kind of like assign the requirements to different people who have access to the assessment, and you can kind of indicate what you are and aren't doing. So that's a helpful kind of first place to start. Also, of course, we are helping our clients with that as well, because it's quite a lot to take in, especially when you dive into the compliance criteria for each thing. And there's an amazing amount of detail from B Lab, but it also, like I said, translates to over 1,000 pages of a PDF. So that's something that we're also helping our clients with, if you're interested.
Yes, definitely. So we've worked with some clients who are doing this themselves, but it does take quite a long time to get used to all of the detail. If you want to move kind of quicker and more robustly and have someone alongside you on that process, then we're kind of tooled up to do a gap analysis kind of efficiently for you. It's absolutely up to you, but love that you're thinking about getting started on that right away. That's definitely what we recommend. So let me have a look at other questions. Thanks for bearing with me. I think we have done that one. Neil asks an interesting question around the EU directive. Does that affect B2B businesses as well as B2C, Amy?
So it seems like it does not. From our research, it's very focused on consumers. But I would say that, to be clear, we are not lawyers. And I think that there's also, a little bit of a gray area around what the definition of consumer is and where that kind of starts and stops, and also the degree of where your responsibility starts and ends. So I would say, if there's any doubt in your mind, and consult your lawyers to check and get their guidance on it, because I certainly wouldn't want to definitively say, but the kind of the general narrative and focus is that this is about products and services that are sold to consumers. So I think the main focus is for B2C.
Great, thanks so much for that, Amy. And then let me find our next question. So Jessica asked a good question where it says that some requirements in the new standard say an action must be completed on initial assessment and further action on recertification. Will those recertifying need to do both of those actions or just the first part? So I'll start with this, and Amy, you can build on it. But just to be clear, anything that talks about kind of year zero or first certification on the new requirements is what recertifying businesses will need to do first on the new standards. And then continuous improvement beyond that will be in year 3 beyond. So consider yourself year 0 and in your first certification of these new standards. You don't need to do anything more than year 0 the first time you go through the process.
Yeah, exactly that. And then to the question of, like, when you do come to recertify in your year 3 on the new standards, whether you have to keep on doing year 0, I think it depends on whether it's a building on question or a replacement question, I think, or requirement, I should say. Within most of them, the year 3 requirement is something that builds on the action that you were doing in year 0. So for the most part, rather than kind of replaces it. And so, yes, for the most part, you'll have to keep maintaining your performance on the year 0 standards and then be adding to them over time. Think of year 0 as the kind of like foundation of being a B Corp, and then you'll just be adding to that as you go.
We've had a couple of questions actually about pending B Corp status. Do you know, Amy, how the new standards impact that process?
You know what? I actually don't know. This is a really good question, and apologies, I don't know the answer, but we can find out and share the answer afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. For those who are on pending B Corp status, what if you're intending to become a B Corp in a year or so from now, once you've had a year of operations, then it's definitely still a good idea to be looking ahead to these new standards, but we're not sure the mechanics of how the new standards will evolve. So yeah, we'll get an answer back to you.
And I think we do have one or two people from B Lab in the audience, so not to put anyone on the spot, but if you know the answer, please feel free to put it in the chat.
Thanks, PLab peers, I appreciate that. So Sarah actually just made a comment to say, we're not there yet, but I'm worried about whether we can reach these new standards, especially in hard and uncertain economic times.
Yeah, which is understandable, totally understandable fear. And some of our clients that we've been supporting through this process have had very similar concerns. And I think a couple things to call out here. One is that B Lab are really wanting to support companies to, especially existing B Corps, to maintain their B Corp status and to transition to these new standards. It's not about this step up in requirements and wanting to kind of like catch out companies or kind of challenge them to do everything immediately. So there's a little bit of kind of patience built in. And for example, actually for existing B Corps who are due to recertify on the new standards next year, that B Lab is giving or certainly B Lab UK, potentially Europe, I need to check, are giving an extension of a year to help you to transition, knowing that it's not as easy as just like, okay, the standards are launched, you better be doing all of this. There's quite a lot of things to consider. So there is the kind of an element, of course, there's a limit to that eventually, but there's an element of grace and support from B Lab in recognizing this. Also, I would say that the new standards, as the finalized standards, they are not quite as rigorous in some ways as the drafts were indicating. So there were some things that were required, or they were being indicated that they were going to be required in the drafts, which were like pretty hard. And, it's such a fine balance for B Lab. And I think they've done a really good job of trying to strike that balance of absolutely it needs to be a standard that is rigorous and holds companies to account and separates out those leaders, in business. But it also can't be so aspirational that it becomes about only a perfect few companies and everybody else gets left behind. So there's got to be that kind of somewhat level of like pragmatism and realism of what it means to be a business, as you say, especially in these difficult times. And so I think that the final version of the standards that have been released have done quite a good job of striking that balance of, yes, tough and meaningful, but not unrealistic to achieve. So I feel your concern, but also I would recommend going on to your assessment and having a look at what's actually required. And I think for the most part, there's going to be areas that companies are already taking action and doing quite well in, and then there'll be some that they aren't. But I think it's doable, for a lot of companies. I think it is doable with the right commitment. So don't worry.
Thanks, Amy. So we've had a couple of questions about impact reports. Do you know how they change under the new standards, Amy? I can speak
Just that, sorry, yeah, just that there's an increase. There's always a requirement as a B Corp who's made their legal change to do an impact report and to publicly share your and be transparent about your performance from a social and environmental point of view. The requirement to this requirement is now kind of doubled down on and built into these requirements. I think not for all tracks. So some tracks don't require as much rigor around that transparency as others. But for the tracks that do, I think honestly it's helpful because again, there's this kind of greater level of clarity and expectation about what that impact report kind of covers and looks at. So I think if anything, it gives B Corps and aspiring B Corps a good kind of framework for what it means to do an impact report in a responsible way.
Great, thank you, Amy. We are at time, but we will run through a couple more questions to try and get through most of them for you. Thanks to everyone who's joined and maybe dropping off now. But for those who are staying on, just wanted to cover a question from Thomas. Do you have any news about what's happening with IBM's, Amy, given that they're not here right now?
No, what I've shared, and I think that B Lab, like I said, B Lab, gosh, they really deserve, kudos. It's a huge undertaking, and so they are focusing on finalizing any glitches with the standards. They're focusing on getting companies transitioned onto the new standards. They're focusing on, more of a priority for them is confirming the verification pathway and the partners that they'll use for that, etc. So again, it's not my place to speak for B Lab, but from everything that I've learned and observed, those are their priorities more than IBM's. And so yeah, all that we know is that it's not goodbye to IBM's, but it's a pause. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Then to cover off the final few questions, there was one around interoperability and where to find this. You can do that by searching in the big PDF. Under each sub-requirement, they list interoperability with GRI, CSRD. I suggest Control F interoperability and you'll find it quite quickly that way.
Also, if you're using the app, which is like a bit less mind-boggling than the PDF, you can click into like more detail, and there's like reams of detail about each requirement, so it'll be there too.
Thanks. And then three more questions. Laura asks, do you know if B Corp training courses have been updated based on the new standards? What I can say is I know that the support portal, B Lab's support portal online and knowledge base has been updated with lots of information. That's the best source of info we've found. Haven't seen any training courses. There may be some coming. Amy, do you know any more about that?
Yeah, so there's also some existing and some coming soon blogs about each of the pillars from B Lab. There is something else that's just left my mind. Oh, there's been a simplified PDF that's been shared, which kind of breaks it down in a bit more accessible terms from B Lab. And there is some training that's going on by B Lab UK for B leaders and for people who, like ourselves, who kind of guide companies through it. And I'm not sure, that it might be that at some stage that training is shared more widely.
Thank you. And then there was a question, anonymous one, about some of the new standards state evidence is needed every year since certification. We certified last year, so we've not been collecting data on company culture yet. How should we go about this?
I expect, and it's hard to say about one definitive standard without seeing it in front of me, but I expect that what they'll mean is certificate. Like again, I think they'll be referring to year zero as in like not since your existing ever certification, but your certification on the new standards. So I'm pretty certain, without seeing the exact thing, that that's what they'll mean. So from new standards onwards.
Yeah, so for your business, it'll be worth understanding what your recertification timeline is. If you certified last year, it's likely that you'll have a number of years before you need to recertify on the new standards. So get clarity on that, and it will be referring to the year that you recertify, not every year in between. Great. And then final question was, are there any differentiators between B Corps then moving to the new standards? We had points in the past. What about now?
Yeah, so at present, no. What B Lab is, and personally, this is just a personal view, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point something does come out that acts as a bit of a differentiator. But right now, what's been shared and indicated is that no, it's just you're certified or you're not.
Right. Thank you. That is really clear. And then Lee's asked for the link to his training, so I'll share the support portal link with you, Lee, and that from B Lab. But that covers all of our questions. So thank you everyone for your patience. We work through them and your kind messages in the chat and your poll responses. We really look forward to continuing this conversation with you, either one-on-one or in future webinars. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody.
Everyone. Bye.